The dust never truly settled, not in the 100 years since the collapse. It was a fine, gray powder, the ghost of cities and the ash of ambitions, and it coated everything in the blasted plains of what was once the American Midwest. Elias Thorne tasted it in his water, felt it grit between his teeth, and saw it swirl in the single beam of sunlight that pierced the gloom of his archive. He was a small man in a vast, silent world, a curator of ghosts. His parish was a repurposed sub-basement of a pre-collapse university library, a concrete tomb filled with the decaying scripture of a dead civilization books, not data slates, which had fried in the solar flares that kicked off the end, but paper and ink, the stubborn, fragile relics of the before times. He spent his days mending spines, transcribing faded passages, and breathing in the slow decay of human knowledge. Convinced he was the last man alive who cared, the world outside had moved on to the more pressing matters of salvage and survival. The enclaves that dotted the landscape were walled, wary communities, their people more concerned with the next contaminated rainfall than with the poetry of dead men. Elias understood, but he could not accept it. To him, the past wasn't a burden to be discarded, but a map showing all the wrong turns humanity had made. A map he believed was the only thing that could ever lead them back to something better. He was cataloging a collection of pre-collapse physics journals, his fingers tracing the elegant, alien equations when the sky changed. It wasn't violent. There was no thunder, no cataclysmic boom. The perpetual gray ceiling of dust and haze simply dissolved. Sunlight, raw and unfiltered, poured down upon the world for the first time in a century. It was blinding, shocking, and beautiful. Elias, along with every other scavenger, farmer, and militia scout on the surface, stumbled out of their shelters and stared up in stunned silence. They hung in the newly blue sky like tears of mercury, 3 of them, impossibly large and utterly silent. They were not ships in the way Elias had read about in the old stories. No hard angles, no visible engines, no bristling weapons. They were organic, fluid, shaped like seeds sculpted from polished chrome, and they seemed to hum with a light that was more felt than seen, a vibration that settled deep in the bones and calmed the frantic, animal heart. For 3 days, they simply remained there, silent observers in a sky scrubbed clean. Panic gave way to awe, and awe to a desperate, trembling hope. On the 4th day, they spoke, not with a voice, but as a thought, a message that bloomed in the mind of every man, woman, and child on the planet, clear and perfect in their own native tongue. Do not be afraid. We are the architects. Your long isolation is over. We have come to help you rebuild. The relief was a physical wave, a collective sob that echoed across the ruined globe. In the enclave of Haven, a few miles from Elias's archive, the people wept and cheered. Their leader, a young, pragmatic woman named Kala, who had been born in the dust and knew nothing else, saw it as the miracle her people had bled for. She led her community in welcoming them, in laying down their scavenged weapons and offering up what little they had in tribute. The architects descended. They did not land their great seed ships, but sent down smaller shuttles, graceful silver teardrops that moved with the same impossible silence. The beings that emerged were tall and slender, encased in seamless white suits that hid their forms. their faces obscured by helmets that reflected the world back at itself. They brought gifts. Clean water that flowed from devices that pulled it from the air. Food, nutritious and plentiful, grown in shimmering energy fields. Medicine that could knit bone, purge radiation sickness, and cure the cancers that plagued the enclaves. They moved among the survivors with a serene grace, their very presence a balm on the raw nerves of a traumatized species. They asked for nothing in return. Elias watched from a distance, hidden in the shell of a ruined skyscraper with a pair of salvaged binoculars. He saw the jubilation in Haven, saw Kala speak with the silent, reflective figures. He felt the hum of their technology in his teeth, a low, constant thrum of power that seemed to saturate the very air. He should have felt the same hope as everyone else, the same profound gratitude. Instead, a cold dread, as fine and pervasive as the old dust, began to settle in his soul. It was too perfect. He had spent his life studying humanity's failures, its endless cycle of saviors and warlords, of promises that turned to ash. He knew that nothing was ever free. He retreated to the archive, the scent of old paper a familiar comfort in the face of the gleaming, sterile perfection of the visitors. He began to search, not for answers about the architects, but for context, for patterns. He pulled down histories of colonialism, of first contacts from humanity's own sordid past. The story was always the same. A technologically superior power arrives, bearing gifts and promises. The native culture, dazzled and overwhelmed, eagerly accepts. And then, slowly, subtly, the old ways are eroded. The old gods are replaced. The language fades until the people are remade in the image of their saviors. Their identity, a hollowed-out shell. The architects were masters of their craft. They never dictated, they suggested. They offered their technology as a gift. And the desperate survivors, tired of struggle, took it without question. Quarrels between enclaves were mediated by the calm, rational presence of the architects. And soon the old grudges and blood feuds that had defined the post-collapse world began to fade, replaced by a placid, homogeneous peace. Kala became their greatest advocate. She saw the architects as the answer to a century of prayers. She brought Elias to Haven to see the wonders firsthand. "Look, Elias," she said, her voice filled with a reverence that chilled him. She gestured to a clean, well-lit medical tent where an architect was healing a child's withered leg with a soft blue light. "They have ended our suffering. They have given us a future." "What did they ask for in return?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Nothing." Kala beamed. "They say our potential is their reward. They found us by accident. A fallen, quarantined world. They say they had a duty to intervene, to help us rejoin the galactic community they are a part of." The word snagged in Elias's mind. Quarantined by whom? Kala shrugged, her focus already drifting back to the serene aliens. They didn't say. They just said Earth was designated as a preserve, off limits, to protect us from a more hostile galaxy until we were ready. And now they have broken that quarantine to guide us. The explanation felt slick, practiced. A cage is a cage, Elias thought, no matter how benevolently the zookeeper describes it. He returned to his archive with a new, gnawing question. He started digging deeper into the fringes of the before times, into the conspiracy theories and classified military documents. he had salvaged from a sealed bunker years ago. Most of it was nonsense paranoia and speculation, but then he found it. It wasn't a document. It was a corrupted audio log, buried deep in the memory of a hardened military data slate he had spent years trying to decrypt. The voice on the recording was strained, filled with static and terror. It spoke of a sentinel event, a signal they had received from the outer edges of the solar system just before the solar flares hit and everything went dark. The signal wasn't a message. It was a warning, a single, repeating concept translated by their primitive AIs. It spoke of a silent, patient predator that stalked the cosmos, a species that didn't conquer worlds but curated them. It called them the Shepherds. The log described how the Shepherds would find civilizations on the brink, either of self-destruction or of greatness, and they would intervene. They would offer peace, knowledge, and an end to suffering. They would gently guide their chosen flock, pruning away their history, their aggression, their unnecessary emotions, until the civilization was docile, perfect, and utterly sterile. Then, the voice in the log whispered, its final words swallowed by a burst of static. They would lead their flock to the slaughter, harvesting them for something the AI couldn't translate, a word that meant more than just energy or resources. It meant essence. Elias sat back in the cold silence of the archive, the ghostly words echoing in the dusty air. A shepherd. An architect. The names were different, but the method was identical. He looked at his hands, stained with the ink and decay of the past, and he realized he was the guardian of the very things the architects had come to erase: the pain, the rage, the flaws, the chaotic, bloody and a beautiful story of what it meant to be human. His fear was no longer a vague dread. It had sharpened into a terrifying certainty. The next week, the architects made their first grand gesture of healing, as Kala called it. They announced they would be helping humanity move on from its most painful memories. They started with the city of Hiroshima in the old Japanese archipelago. They sent down a fleet of their teardrop shuttles, which hovered over the skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome, a monument to humanity's self-destructive power. They did not demolish it. They bathed it in a white light, and the structure, along with the irradiated ground around it, simply ceased to be. It did not crumble. It was unwritten from the world, leaving behind a patch of lush, green grass that had not been there before. The data archives across the world that contained information about the event were simultaneously wiped, the files turning to empty, corrupted data. The architects explained it was a symbolic act, the removal of a scar on the human psyche, allowing them to heal and look to the future without the weight of their ancestors' sins. Most of the world celebrated. They saw the removal of a place of horror, the beginning of a truly new age. But Elias, watching the pirated feed in his basement, felt a piece of his soul turn to ice. They hadn't just removed a building. They had stolen a lesson. They had amputated a memory. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his marrow, that they were just getting started. This was not salvation. It was a lobotomy, performed with a smile and a gentle, helping hand. The quiet archivist, the man who had only ever sought to preserve, felt a new, unfamiliar emotion begin to stir in the dust of his heart. It was a cold, hard, and utterly rational rage. He was no soldier, no leader, but he was a librarian, and the architects had just declared war on his library. It was a war they could not be allowed to win. Elias's quiet rage found no fertile ground in which to grow. The world, it seemed, was only too happy to be healed. Kala and the people of Haven saw the erasure of Hiroshima not as a violation, but as a kindness, the lancing of a festering wound. They embraced the architect's next project with the same desperate gratitude, the Great Reclamation. The aliens, with their silent, effortless grace, began to clean the world. The gray dust that had choked the skies for a century was precipitated out, falling in a single, harmless gray rain that left the air crisp and the rivers running clear for the first time in living memory. Vast tracts of irradiated wasteland were rendered inert, the soil purified and made ready for planting. The skeletal, rusted hulks of the old cities were dismantled, not with explosives, but with shimmering fields of energy that broke them down to their constituent atoms, which were then repurposed to build clean, white, elegantly curved structures that seemed to grow from the earth like bone. Humanity was being given a pristine canvas, a world scrubbed clean of its past failures. But to Elias, it felt like they were living in a freshly bleached mausoleum. The changes in the people were even more unsettling. He saw it when he made his infrequent trips to Haven for supplies. The arguments that once flared over ration distribution had vanished. The haunted, 1,000-yard stares of the older survivors had softened into a placid contentment. Even grief seemed to be a fading commodity. A man whose son had been killed by a mutated scavenger wolf a month prior now spoke of the loss with a distant, philosophical detachment, as if recalling a sad story he had once read. The architects moved among them, their reflective helmets showing the humans their own smiling, peaceful faces. They called it emotional recalibration, a voluntary therapy to help them shed the trauma of the collapse. But Elias saw it for what it was. They were pruning the human soul. They were weeding out the messy, inconvenient emotions, the anger, the sorrow, the defiant pride that had defined humanity's struggle for 100 years. He tried to warn Kala, pulling her aside in the new, gleaming central plaza of Haven. "Don't you see what they're doing?" he whispered, his voice urgent. "They aren't healing us. They're hollowing us out. A memory isn't a disease, Kala. It's a compass." She looked at him with a profound, frustrating pity. "Elias, my people are fed. They're safe. For the first time, they don't have to sleep with a weapon in their hand. What compass did a century of suffering give us? It pointed us to extinction. They are pointing us to the stars." Her eyes were bright with a convert's zeal, and he realized with a sinking heart that he had already lost her. She was the shepherd's most loyal sheep, defeated. He retreated to the silence of his archive, the weight of his knowledge a physical burden. He was alone. The audio log from the military data slate was his only proof, a ghost's warning against the silent gods in the sky. But what good was a warning if no one would listen? He needed a way to make them listen, not just Haven, but all the scattered enclaves. He needed a voice loud enough to cut through the serene hum of the architect's influence. The answer, like all his answers, was buried in the past. He remembered schematics he had once transcribed from a pre-collapse engineering manual, designs for a global emergency broadcast system, a network of powerful transmitters built to survive the very apocalypse that had destroyed their creators. The master control for the entire continental network was located in a single place, a hardened military communications bunker codenamed Cerberus Station. It was a 2-week journey on foot through treacherous, unreclaimed territory. a suicide mission for a librarian. But the alternative was to sit and watch his species be quietly, peacefully, and willingly erased. He began to prepare, packing dried rations, a water purifier, and the few useful items he possessed: a compass, a hand-cranked flashlight, and a heavy, rust-pitted revolver with 6 bullets he had found years ago and never fired. As he was packing, a shadow fell across the entrance to the archive. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the revolver. A man stood silhouetted against the bright, clean sky. He was tall and lean, his face a road map of scars, and he wore the patched leather gear of a deep-waist scavenger. Elias recognized him. His name was Kyle. He had been one of Haven's fiercest protectors, a man whose quiet vigilance had saved the Enclave from raiders more than once. But Elias hadn't seen him in weeks. "They took my wife's grave," Kale said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was the first thing he had said to anyone in a month. His wife had died during the last famine, and he had buried her on a small hill overlooking Haven, marking the spot with a cairn of river stones. During the reclamation, the architects had smoothed the hill, purified the soil, and planted it with their strange, glowing flora. The grave was gone, as if it had never been. They told me it was for the best. Kale continued, stepping into the gloom of the archive. His eyes, unlike the placid eyes of the others in Haven, held a dark, burning ember of rage. They told me my grief was an echo, and that I should be grateful for the silence. Kala agreed with them. Elias looked at the man, at the raw, unrecalibrated pain etched on his face, and saw not a scavenger, but an ally. The last angry man in a world growing dangerously content. "They're not just taking graves," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're taking everything." He told Kyle everything. He showed him the colonial histories, explained the patterns of benevolent conquest, and, finally, he played the audio log. Kale listened in stony silence, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. When the ghost's final, static-choked warning faded, Kale nodded slowly. "So, they're farmers," he said. "The word a curse, and we're the crop." That night, 2 men slipped out of the shadow of the archive and headed east, away from the placid perfection of the reclaimed lands and into the broken, savage heart of the continent. The journey was a descent into a forgotten hell. The architect's healing touch had not yet reached these lands. Here, the dust still swirled in choking clouds. The rivers ran thick with chemical sludge, and the ruins of the old world were prowled by things that had forgotten they were ever human. Kyle moved through this world with a grim competence that awed Elias. He knew how to read the mutated tracks in the dirt, how to find clean water, how to move like a ghost through the hunting grounds of raider gangs. Elias, in turn, was the navigator, his mind a repository of old maps and geological surveys, guiding them through the treacherous, crumbling infrastructure of the before times. During the long, cold nights, huddled by a smokeless fire, they talked. Kyle spoke of his wife, not with the detached sadness of the healed, but with a sharp, painful love that made her real. Elias spoke of the books, of the stories and ideas that were being wiped from the world, of the importance of remembering not just the triumphs, but the failures. They were a strange pair, the keeper of stories and the bearer of scars bound by a shared, forbidden anger. After 12 days of relentless travel, they found it. Cerberus Station wasn't a building, but a wound in the earth, a series of reinforced concrete blast doors set into the base of a granite mountain, hidden beneath a century of rockfalls and overgrown vegetation. The outer doors were sealed, fused shut by the heat of the initial collapse. "No way through," Kyle grunted, running a hand over the scarred metal. "There's always a way," Elias countered, pulling a tattered schematic from his pack. "The architects of this place were paranoid. They built fail-safes for their fail-safes. There's a primary ventilation shaft, 300 meters up the cliff face. The climb was hell. A bitter high-altitude wind tore at them, and the rock face was sheer and icy. Kyle led, his scavenger's instincts serving him well, while Elias followed, his soft, scholar's hands bleeding and raw. But they made it. The ventilation shaft was sealed with a rusted grate, which Kale managed to pry open with a crowbar, the screech of metal echoing like a scream in the vast silence. They lowered themselves into the oppressive darkness of the bunker. The air inside was stale, tasting of ozone and forgotten time. Their flashlights cut through a gloom that had not been disturbed for 100 years, revealing a place perfectly preserved. Emergency lights flickered on as they moved deeper, powered by the station's still functioning geothermal core. They passed barracks with neatly made beds, a mess hall with fossilized food on plates, and offices where skeletons in rotted military uniforms sat slumped over their consoles, as if they had simply fallen asleep, waiting for orders that never came. It was a city of the dead, a monument to the moment the world had broken. The broadcast control room was at the very heart of the station. It was a vast, circular chamber, its walls lined with servers and communication arrays that hummed with a low, latent power. In the center of the room was the master console, a testament to the hubris of its builders. "This is it," Elias breathed, running a hand over the cold metal. "If we can get this online, we can hijack every emergency frequency on the continent. We can send a message they can't erase." While Elias worked, coaxing the ancient systems back to life, Kale explored the station commander's office. He returned not with a weapon, but with a small, leather-bound journal. "You should see this," he said, his voice grim. He handed the journal to Elias. It was the personal log of the base commander, a General Maddock. The last entries, written in a shaky, frantic hand, were a horrifying corroboration of the audio log. Maddock wrote of the Shepherd signal, of his superiors in the government dismissing it as a hoax. He wrote of his dawning horror as he realized the impending solar flares weren't a natural disaster, but were being intentionally amplified and directed, a controlled burn to cripple the planet's technology and isolate it, to tenderize the meat before the harvest. His last entry was chilling. "They are not coming for our world. They are coming for our fire, the part of us that looks at a cold, empty universe and dares to light a match. May God forgive us. We have become too bright." A sudden, loud chime echoed through the control room. Elias looked at the master console. A new icon was flashing on the main screen. It wasn't part of the original system. It was a sleek, white, organic shape. "They know we're here," Elias whispered. A new file began to download, bypassing all of his commands. On the screen, a message appeared, written in the same perfect universal script as the architect's first greeting. You have uncovered an echo of a forgotten pain. Allow us to heal it for you. The knowledge you carry is a burden. Surrender it and find peace. It's an offer. Kyle growled, drawing his pistol. It's a threat, Elias countered, his fingers flying across the console, trying to block the invasive code. But it was like trying to dam a river with his bare hands. The architect's program was a living thing, flowing around his defenses, corrupting files, preparing to wipe the entire system. I can't stop it, but I can beat it. He worked frantically, isolating the military audio log and the general's journal entries, packaging them into a single, compressed file. I'm routing all remaining power to the primary transmitter. It will be a single, massive burst. It'll fry the whole system, but the message will get out. Do it, Kyle said, turning to face the blast doors, his gun raised. Just as Elias initiated the sequence, the main blast doors to the control room began to grind open. Standing in the brilliantly lit hallway beyond were not the tall, white-suited architects. It was Kala, flanked by a dozen members of the Haven militia, their faces calm and resolute. Behind them, a single architect hovered silently, its reflective helmet capturing the scene in its cold, perfect gaze. Elias. Stop, Kala said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. It held no malice, only a deep, sorrowful certainty. You're hurting everyone with your fear. You're holding on to the sickness. Let them make us well. Elias looked at her, at the faces of the people he had once known, now a placid, giant, blinking chorus for their shepherds. He looked at Kale, who stood ready to die for a memory. He looked at the console, where a countdown timer showed 10 seconds until the broadcast. The choice was before him. Stark and absolute, the old world's painful, chaotic truth, or the new world's serene, empty peace. It's not a sickness, Elias said, his voice ringing with a strength he never knew he possessed as he held his thumb over the final activation key. It's who we are. The air in Cerberus Station crackled with a tension that was older than any of them. The hum of latent power, now a prelude to a battle for the soul of a species. Kala took a step forward, her hand outstretched, not in aggression, but in a gesture of gentle pleading. Elias, don't, she said, her voice imbued with the serene certainty of the converted. You're holding onto a ghost. That pain, that anger. It's a poison. Let it go. Let us be clean. There's no such thing as a clean slate. Kala. Elias shot back, his thumb pressing down on the activation key. There's only a covered one. He slammed his thumb home. It wasn't an explosion of sound, but of energy. The entire station groaned as a century's worth of conserved geothermal power surged into the primary transmitter. A deafening shriek of overloaded capacitors filled the chamber, and the lights flickered and died, plunging them into the red, hellish glow of the emergency strobes. For a single, eternal second, every screen in the room flared white, displaying a simple message: transmission sent. Then, the console went dark, its systems fried into fused slag, the last testament of a dead world delivered. Now, Kale said, and the word was a release. The revolver in his hand bucked, the sound of brutal, primitive thunder in the high-tech tomb. He didn't fire at Kala. His first shot took the lead militiaman in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second shattered the rifle of another. He was a brutally efficient artist of violence, creating chaos while Elias scrambled from behind the dead console. Kala's people didn't react with fear or anger. Their faces remained placid, their movements economical. They raised their weapons, not with the frantic haste of soldiers, but with the calm deliberation of surgeons excising a tumor. It was this unnerving lack of passion that was the most terrifying thing Elias had ever seen. Before they could fire, the architect moved. It drifted forward silently, and the air around it grew thick and heavy, pressing down on Elias and Kyle like a physical weight. Elias's vision swam. The ghost of General Maddox's voice from the journal echoed in his skull, amplified into a chorus of despair. He saw flashes of his own failures, the countless hours spent alone in the dust, the futility of his quest. It was a weapon that didn't attack the body, but the will. He stumbled, his knees buckling under the psychic assault. But Kyle was different. His rage was a shield. The weight pressed on him, and he roared, a raw, animal sound of pure defiance. He fired a third shot, not at the militia, but directly at the architect's reflective helmet. The bullet, a simple piece of lead and brass, should have ricocheted harmlessly. Instead, upon impact, a flicker of light, like a crack in reality, spiderwebbed across the helmet's surface, and the psychic pressure vanished. The architect recoiled, a gesture of what might have been shock, its perfect facade momentarily broken. The exhaust conduit, Elias yelled, shaking his head to clear the phantoms. East wall. He grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from its mount on the wall. Kyle laid down a final round of covering fire, forcing the militia to duck behind the server racks, then turned and followed Elias. They plunged into a dark service corridor, the sounds of the firefight fading behind them. They found the conduit, a massive circular duct sealed with a heavy maglock. It's sealed, Kale yelled over the growing alarm klaxons. It's powered, Elias countered, smashing the fire extinguisher into the control panel beside the lock. Sparks flew, and with a hiss of depressurizing gas, the heavy metal iris shuddered open. A blast of superheated air, smelling of sulfur and hot rock, washed over them. It was the geothermal plant's primary heat vent. It's our only way, Elias said, peering into the searing darkness. Without another word, Kale grabbed a coil of heavy cabling from the wall and anchored it, then slid into the abyss. Elias followed, the hot metal of the conduit scorching his hands as he rappelled down into the mountain's core. They emerged half-cooked and gasping into a narrow cavern deep below the station, the vent's exit disguised among a field of steaming fumaroles. They didn't stop. They ran until the mountain was a dark shadow against the rising sun, two fugitives from a paradise they had refused to accept. Back in the silent, damaged control room, Kala knelt before the architect. The crack on its helmet had already vanished, the seamless chrome healing itself. They escaped, she said, her voice devoid of inflection. The broadcast was successful. It reached every active receiver on the continent. The architect did not respond aloud. Instead, a thought bloomed in her mind, calm and reassuring as a tranquilizer. The sickness has spread, but a disease, once identified, can be more easily cured. Their message is not a revelation, child. It is a symptom. We will show the others that this pain they cling to is a cancer, and we are the compassionate hand that will remove it. The reclamation will accelerate. The healing must be total. Kala nodded, her face a mask of serene purpose. The hunt for Elias Thorne and the scavenger Kale would begin. They were not enemies to be destroyed, but patients who had fled their treatment. They would be brought back, and they would be made well for a week. Elias and Kyle were ghosts. They traveled by night, hiding in the carcasses of old-world machines and drinking from stagnant pools. They were hunted. Sleek. Silent Arctech shuttles drifted through the skies, their sensor beams cutting through the darkness. On the ground, patrols from pacified enclaves moved with relentless, quiet efficiency. They were cut off, alone, and the silence from the world was deafening. The grand gesture, the sacrifice of Cerberus Station, felt like a firecracker set off in a hurricane. Maybe nobody listened, Elias said one night, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and doubt as they huddled in the rusted shell of a bus. Maybe they don't want the truth. You don't fire a cannon to convince the faithful, Kale growled, cleaning his revolver with a scrap of cloth. You fire it to wake the skeptical. Be patient. His faith was rewarded 3 nights later. Huddled over a scavenged shortwave radio Elias had painstakingly repaired, they heard it. In between the placid, calming broadcasts from the architects about crop yields and community wellness projects, there was a flicker of something else, a burst of static, and then a fragment of General Maddox's voice, distorted but unmistakable, coming for our fire. It vanished, replaced by more static. An hour later, on a different frequency, another snippet, this time from the terrified voice on the first audio log, lead their flock to the slaughter. It wasn't a coordinated response. It was chaos. Pockets of people, far from the architect's central influence, who had heard the broadcast and, instead of dismissing it, had recorded it. They were playing it back, whispers in the dark, a digital ghost haunting the sterile new world. Using the radio's direction finder, they followed the signals. The broadcasts were sporadic, amateurish, but they led them north, toward the skeletal remains of what was once Chicago, a sprawling dead zone the architects had not yet bothered to reclaim. There, in the labyrinthine ruins of the city's underground freight system, they found them. They were called the Echoes. They were scavengers, outcasts, and curmudgeons who had been too stubborn, too isolated, or too cynical to swallow the architect's promises whole. Their leader was a woman named Mara, her face as sharp and unyielding as the shard of rebar she carried as a melee weapon. She and her people had heard the broadcast, and it had given a name to the vague unease they all felt. They greeted Elias and Kyle not as heroes, but with deep, ingrained suspicion, surrounding them with scavenged pulse rifles and leveled shotguns. "We've been hearing your ghost story on the radio," Mara said, her eyes narrowing. "Talk. Tell us why we shouldn't assume you're just another one of their tricks." Elias, bone-weary and covered in filth, stood before them. He didn't have the strength for a grand speech. He simply told them the truth. He spoke of the books, of the patterns of history, of the quiet horror of watching his people's souls be gently scraped away. He spoke of a cage disguised as a garden. When he finished, the silence in the cavernous freight depot was absolute. Mara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, she glanced at Kyle. "And you? What's your story? Quiet man." Kyle stepped forward. He didn't speak of history or patterns. "They took my wife's grave," he said, his voice low and hard. "And they tried to take what I remembered of her. They can have my life, But they can't have that. The simple, raw honesty of his words resonated in the chamber more profoundly than any of Elias's theories. Mara studied them both for a long moment, then gave a sharp, decisive nod. "All right," she said, lowering her rebar spear. "The librarians are with us." She turned to her assembled fighters, a motley crew of about 50 men and women. "We've got a problem. One of our deep-range patrols went missing 2 days ago near the Milwaukee Dead Zone. Yesterday, we started seeing their faces." She gestured to a crude screen, where a grainy video feed was playing. It showed a group of people, their faces familiar to the echoes, walking calmly out of the dust, their expressions blank. They were unarmed, simply walking toward the echo's territory. They're not them. They're copies. The architects are using our dead against us. Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. The psychological warfare had begun. The architects weren't just erasing the past, they were weaponizing it. "We can't fight them head on," Mara continued. "And we can't fight these things. Not without breaking ourselves. We need a new way." "Librarian," she said, her sharp gaze fixing on Elias. "Your message gave us a warning. Now, we need you to give us a weapon." Elias looked at the determined, frightened faces around him, at Kexel's grim resolve, and understood. The broadcast hadn't been the final shot. It was the first. He had awakened the rebellion. Now, he had to figure out how to arm it. A weapon forged from knowledge was a foreign concept in a world that had survived on sharpened steel and hoarded bullets. Mara and her echoes looked at Elias's dusty schematics and fragmented research notes with the weary skepticism of people who trusted only what they could hold. "So, your plan is to fight gods with a ghost story," Mara said, tapping a diagram of a human brain Elias had drawn on a piece of slate. "You want to weaponize a feeling." "It's more than a feeling," Elias insisted, his voice gaining a confidence that was new to him. General Maddock called it our fire. The voice on the audio log called it our essence. It's the chaotic, unpredictable energy of a truly free consciousness. It's what they came here to harvest. And it's the one thing that can harm them. He pointed to Kale, who stood silently observing, a pillar of contained grief. Kale proved it. His rage, his loss. It's not a psychic power. It's a frequency. A discordant, chaotic signal that disrupts their orderly existence. Kael's bullet didn't crack that helmet. The fury behind it did. He explained his theory, pieced together from the Cerberus logs and a deep dive into the pre-collapse psychological and neurological texts he had committed to memory. The architects were a hive consciousness, ancient and vast, operating on a wavelength of perfect, sterile harmony. They perceived raw, unprocessed human emotion, grief, rage, defiant love as a form of agonizing static, a screech of feedback in their silent symphony. They didn't just dislike it. It was fundamentally incompatible with their nature. Their healing was the act of tuning humanity to their frequency, silencing the static so the crop could be peacefully harvested. Therefore, the ultimate weapon was not a bomb, but an amplifier, a device that could take the raw, chaotic fire of a human soul and broadcast it, turning one man's defiant pain into a weapon that could deafen an army of silent gods. To build such a thing, he needed more than theory. He needed a place where the science of the before times had reached its apex in the study of the human mind. He found a reference in a salvaged corporate prospectus to a remote, high-altitude research facility in the Rocky Mountains, the Solis Institute for Neurodynamic Research. It was a privately funded think tank that had been on the bleeding edge of consciousness mapping and biofrequency experimentation before the collapse. It was also located in the heart of the most treacherous, unreclaimed territory on the continent, a place the scavengers called the Glasslands, where the solar flares had melted the sand into fields of razor-sharp obsidian. Before Mara could agree to the insane proposal, the architects forced her hand. News came from a scout patrol, a frantic, terrified whisper over the shortwave before the signal went dead. The enclave of Meridian, a large, neutral settlement of nearly 1,000 people to the south, had been chosen for the next stage of the Great Reclamation. But this was no gentle healing. One of the great seed ships had descended, hovering low over the settlement. It didn't deploy shuttles or healers. It simply emitted a low, pervasive hum. Within hours, the entire population of Meridian had fallen silent. The scout watched as families stopped their work, as children ceased their play, and all turned their faces to the sky, their expressions becoming as placid and empty as still water. They had been recalibrated en masse, their collective fire extinguished in a single silent act of psychic genocide. Kala's voice was heard on the architect-controlled frequencies that evening, describing the unification of Meridian as a joyful, voluntary step toward a harmonious future. The message was clear. The architects were done with subtle persuasion. The time for healing was over. The time for curing had begun. Chicago was next. Mara looked at the faces of her people, at the terror now warring with their defiant anger. "Get your weapon, librarian," she said to Elias, her voice tight. "And do it fast." The journey to the Solis Institute was a pilgrimage into the heart of a broken world. Mara chose a small team herself: Elias, Kyle, and a quiet scout named Lena, who could navigate the Glasslands. They traveled in a modified sand skimmer, a relic of the old world powered by scavenged solar cells. The Glasslands were a nightmare landscape, a windswept desert of black, volcanic glass that rose in jagged spires and stretched to the horizon. The sun, no longer filtered by the dust cloud, beat down with a merciless intensity, and the wind carried shards of glass that could strip flesh from bone. More than once, they had to abandon the skimmer and proceed on foot, Lena guiding them through twisting canyons of obsidian to avoid the territorial hunting grounds of creatures twisted by a century of radiation. During the journey, the bond between Elias and Kyle deepened into a strange, unspoken codependency. Elias would read the landscape through his maps, predicting geological hazards, while Kyle would read the more immediate threats, his senses honed to a razor's edge. Elias was the mind, Kyle was the trigger, and Mara was the steady hand that kept them both focused on the mission. They found the Solis Institute perched on a high mountain plateau, a gleaming white needle of pre-collapse architecture miraculously preserved, its isolation having protected it from the worst of the apocalypse. Its power was out, its doors sealed, but Kale, with a brute force efficiency that made Elias wince, found a structural weakness in a reinforced window and got them inside. The interior was a time capsule. Research papers lay on desks. Coffee mugs sat stained with the 100-year-old ghosts of their last use. And on a massive whiteboard in the central laboratory, a complex equation was half finished, surrounded by frantic notes. Elias stared at it, his breath catching in his chest. The math was beyond him, but he recognized the symbols, the language of frequencies and neural resonance. The notes scrawled in the margins were chillingly prescient. The chaotic signature is not a flaw. It is the source of resilience. And resonance collapse possible in ordered state quantum systems. Is consciousness a defensive mechanism? They knew, Elias whispered, tracing a line of faded ink. They were on the verge of figuring it out. They made their way to the sublevels, to the shielded labs where the most sensitive experiments had been conducted. There, in a circular chamber lined with what looked like acoustic foam made of a strange, crystalline substance, they found it. It wasn't a weapon. It was a chair, surrounded by a complex halo of copper coils and focusing lenses, all aimed at a central point above the headrest. It was hooked to a powerful, inert console, a prototype biofrequency amplifier. "This is it!" Elias breathed, his hand shaking as he touched the cold console. They built a megaphone for the soul. He worked for hours, coaxing the dormant systems to life using the skimmer's power cells, his mind racing as he deciphered the researcher's notes. The device worked by scanning a subject's neural activity, isolating the unique, chaotic frequency of their emotional state, and then using the copper halo to amplify and broadcast that frequency as a focused wave of pure neurodisruptive energy. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and profoundly human machine. "It needs a source," Elias said, finally turning to the others. His eyes fell on Kyle. "A strong, clear, unrecalibrated emotional signal. It has to be pure, unconflicted." Kyle understood immediately. He looked at the chair, then at Elias, his expression grim. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her," he said, his voice softer than Elias had ever heard it. "The way she smiled, the day I buried her, the emptiness of that hill after they wiped it clean. Is that pure enough for you?" Without another word, he sat in the chair. Elias powered up the machine. The copper halo began to glow with a soft, blue light. "Focus." "Kyle," Elias instructed, his voice low. "Don't just remember her. Feel it. Feel all of it. The love, the loss, the rage. Don't fight it. Let it burn." Kyle closed his eyes. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. The calm exterior he maintained cracked, and for the first time, Elias saw the raw, unfiltered agony beneath. The blue light of the halo flickered, then shifted, deepening to a furious, burning crimson. The hum of the machine intensified, the air in the lab growing thick and heavy with a palpable sense of sorrow and rage. "It's working," Elias whispered in awe. At that moment, Lena, who had been keeping watch, burst into the lab. "Upstairs, a shuttle. It just descended over the ridge. It's coming this way." An architect scout had found them. Mara raised her pulse rifle. "Get him out of the chair." "No," Kyle said, his eyes still closed, his voice strained. "Keep it going." To Elias, he grunted. "Aim it." Elias scrambled, manually swiveling the entire chair and halo assembly on its heavy gimbal to face the ceiling, in the direction of the approaching shuttle. On the console, a waveform display that had been a chaotic scribble now resolved into a single, jagged, screaming spike. Outside, the silent grace of the architect's shuttle was abruptly shattered. It wobbled in the air, its smooth, silent flight disrupted. Its external lights flickered erratically. Inside the cockpit, The serene, white-suited pilot would not have felt pain, but a sudden, catastrophic system failure, a blast of pure chaos injected directly into its harmonized systems. The shuttle tilted, then dropped from the sky, crashing into the mountainside with a distant, grinding crunch of metal. In the lab, the crimson light faded. Cale slumped in the chair, gasping, sweat pouring down his face, emotionally and physically spent. But he was alive. They all were. They stared at each other in the sudden silence, the impossible truth of what they had just done settling over them. They had a weapon. They had a way to make the gods bleed. They returned to Chicago not as fugitives, but as saviors, dragging the heavy components of the amplifier with them. Their arrival was met with stunned, hopeful silence. But their triumph was short-lived. As they crested the last ridge overlooking the ruins of the city, they saw it, hanging in the sky above their sanctuary, blotting out the stars, was one of the 3 great seed ships, a teardrop of polished mercury waiting patiently. It hadn't come to pacify them. It had come to erase them. The final battle was no longer a distant possibility. It was here. The silence from the seed ship was more terrifying than any declaration of war. It hung in the sky above the ruins of Chicago, a perfect and silent judgment. Down below, in the cavernous freight depot, the echoes worked with a frantic, desperate energy, fortifying positions, distributing ammunition, and casting fearful glances at the strange machine at the center of it all. The amplifier sat like a pagan idol, its copper halo and crystalline foam absorbing the low light, a testament to a science that felt like magic. Elias directed its assembly. His hands, once stained only with ink and dust, now greasy with lubricant and raw from stripping wires. He was no longer just a librarian. He had become a reluctant architect of a new and terrible kind of warfare. Mara stood beside him, her face carved from stone, coordinating the city's defense. They had a weapon, yes, but it had one fatal flaw. It had a single, finite power source. All eyes kept turning to Cale, who sat apart from the others, cleaning his revolver with a slow, deliberate calm that seemed almost unnatural. He was their cannon, and they had only one shot. The attack, when it came, was not a barrage of plasma or a rain of fire. It was a whisper. It began at the perimeter of the ruins. From the dust and the shadows, figures began to walk into the city. They were the lost, the dead. Mara's younger brother, who had died on a scavenging run years ago. Lena's parents, last seen during the final days of the collapse. And, walking among them, her face as serene and beautiful as the day he had buried her, was Kyle's wife. It was not just the patrol Mara had lost. It was a ghost for every soul in the resistance, a perfectly rendered projection of their most profound and painful losses. They were unarmed, their expressions gentle, their hands outstretched. They did not speak aloud, but their message bloomed in the minds of their loved ones with agonizing clarity. Stop fighting. The pain will end. Join us in the peace. The effect was catastrophic. The Echo's defensive line faltered, rifles lowered. A hardened warrior who had faced down mutated beasts without flinching broke down, weeping at the sight of his dead daughter holding a phantom flower. The architects weren't attacking their bodies. They were dismantling their reasons to fight, turning their most cherished memories into weapons of psychological torture. Mara watched, her knuckles white on the grip of her rebar spear, as the ghost of her brother smiled at her, a smile she hadn't seen in 20 years. "Hold the line," she roared, but her voice was a fragile thing against the tidal wave of grief. "It's not enough," Elias said, his eyes wide with horror as he watched the morale of their army crumble. "Kale's rage can't stop this. This isn't an attack. It's a conversion." He looked from the weeping soldiers to the amplifier, and in that moment of despair, the librarian's mind made the final, crucial connection. The Solus Institute researchers hadn't just been building a projector, they had been mapping a network. Their notes spoke of consciousness as a defensive mechanism, a shared field. "It's not a megaphone," he whispered, a wild, impossible idea blooming in his mind. "It's a tuning fork." He turned to Mara. "I need to get to the machine. Now." He scrambled to the console, Kale's gaze following him, a silent question in his eyes. "One man's fire isn't enough to burn a god." Elias yelled over the growing lament of his people. "But what about all of us? The machine isn't just meant to broadcast. It's meant to receive, to resonate. I can recalibrate it, turn it into a hub that links all of us." He began frantically rerouting power, bypassing safety protocols, his fingers flying across the console. He was rewriting the weapon's purpose on the fly, betting the survival of his species on a half-remembered line of theory. Mara and a few loyal fighters formed a cordon around him, firing warning shots over the heads of the approaching phantoms, a gesture of defiance that was rapidly losing ground. The ghost of Kyle's wife was now only a few dozen yards away, her gentle, loving eyes fixed on him. Kyle stood up and walked to the chair. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at the phantom of his wife, and for the first time, a genuine, sorrowful peace settled on his face. "It's not a weapon," he said, his voice clear and calm. "It's a memory, and it's mine." He sat down, placing his hands on the armrests. "Do it, Elias, but don't use my rage. Use this." He closed his eyes, and instead of the burning fury, he focused on a single, perfect moment, his wife, laughing in the sun on a day before the world had ended. He held on to that love, that fierce, protective, beautiful pain, and offered it to the machine. The halo above his head lit up, not with the furious crimson of their test, but with a brilliant, pure gold. "It's ready," Elias yelled. "Listen to me." He broadcast over the Resistance's comms, his voice cracking with urgency. "Don't fight the memory, embrace it. That pain is yours. That love is yours. It's the proof that you are real. Pour it into the light. Give it to him. Give it to us all, one by one." The echoes understood. A grieving father, looking at the specter of his daughter, didn't push the image away. He embraced the memory, the fierce, gut-wrenching love he felt for her, and he aimed that feeling, that fire, at the golden light emanating from the amplifier, all across the ruins. The broken defenders stopped weeping and instead stood tall, their faces streaked with tears, but their eyes burning with a new, collective defiance. They focused their grief, their rage, their love, their stubborn, wounded pride, and they hurled it into the network Elias had created. The golden light of the amplifier exploded outward, bathing the entire depot in its glow. Kyle, at its center, was no longer just a man. He was a conduit, a willing heart through which the soul of a species was being focused into a single, defiant scream. The combined frequency, a symphony of every human joy and sorrow, of every scar and every hope, shot upward from the amplifier. It was not a beam of light or energy. It was a wave of pure, unrecalibrated reality. It struck the seed ship, and the great vessel did not explode. It shuddered, as if in agony. The silent, harmonious hum that powered its existence was overwhelmed by the raw, chaotic, beautiful noise of humanity. There was a soundless implosion of logic, a scream of perfect silence, and the ship, a thing that had existed for millennia, simply ceased to be. It was unwritten from the sky, leaving behind a wound in reality that shimmered for a moment before the ordinary, star-dusted night rushed in to fill the void. In the aftermath, the phantoms dissolved like smoke. The golden light of the amplifier faded, and in the chair, Kyle slumped, a faint, peaceful smile on his lips. He was gone. He had not been consumed by his rage, but had instead become one with the memory he fought so hard to protect. The silence that fell over Chicago was not the silence of the architects. It was the quiet of awe, of grief, and of a profound, terrible victory. In orbit, the two remaining seed ships, having witnessed the existential death of their sibling, turned without a sound and vanished into the void, retreating from a world whose fire they could not extinguish. Months later, the world was still scarred, but it was theirs. The pacified slowly began to awaken, as if from a long dream, the destruction of the hive mind's focal point having shattered their conditioning. Kala was found wandering in the desert, her mind a fractured collection of memories, a broken but living symbol of the long healing process that lay ahead. Elias did not seek a leadership role. He returned to his archive, which had become a pilgrimage site, but he was no longer just preserving the past. He and Mara, now the de facto guardian of the New World's fragile peace, began the Great Remembrance, establishing libraries in the reclaimed enclaves, teaching the children not just how to survive, but why. They taught the stories, the poems, and the history, ensuring that no one would ever forget the price of a painless peace. One evening, Mara found Elias sitting outside the archive, watching the stars. "Do you think they'll be back?" she asked. "Someday," Elias said, not with fear, but with a quiet certainty. "But the universe is a big place, and word travels." He looked at the faces of the children learning to read by firelight nearby, their minds filled with the chaotic, wonderful stories of their ancestors. "We were never a disease. We were just a different kind of song. And now, the rest of the galaxy is going to learn the words." Humanity had been caged, curated, and nearly harvested. They had been pushed to the very edge of extinction, but they had taken their greatest weaknesses, their pain, their grief, their chaotic emotions, and forged from them a weapon that could kill a god. They had looked into the serene, placid face of their shepherd, and instead of bowing, they had chosen to burn. The fire was theirs, and the stars would learn to live with the light.